So, this is going to come as a surprise to most of you, but I'm actually a pretty big fan of MonolithSoft's work.
Well, no shit.
If I wanted, I could do the obnoxious hipster thing and say, I was into Monolithsoft before it was cool, and it would still be 100% accurate. Back in 2002, I was following the upcoming release of Xenosaga Episode 1 in Game Informer magazine, and was one of the first to own the game when it dropped in early 2003. I stuck with them through the dark times when everyone, myself included, was clowning on Episode 2, and was probably one of like 10 people who pre-ordered Episode 3. So I've been really happy over the past decade to see the studio becoming one of the most successful and prestigious RPG makers on the planet thanks to the continuing success of Xenoblade. And this success has spilled over to their back catalog as well. As my series on Xenosaga made clear, there's still a dedicated fan base for that series in the English-speaking world, probably a bigger fan base now than when the games were initially released. But in spite of all this success, not all their previous work has returned to the forefront of fan consciousness. To be more specific, there's one game in particular that seems to have been completely overlooked by most people. The game in question is Soma Bringer, an action RPG released for the Nintendo DS in February of 2008. While nowhere near the blockbuster release of a Xenoblade, Soma Bringer is still a very solid game in its own right, and is arguably one of the most important games Monolithsoft ever released. For those reasons, the game deserves better than to be forgotten, and so once again, I'm going to do what little I can to raise its profile. So, to understand why Soma Bringer is so significant in Monolithsoft's history, we need to go back to the mid-2000s. In stark contrast to today, where the studio has a rabid fanbase who buys their games in droves, at that time, Monolithsoft's status was, at least among American fans, barely better than a joke. Xenosaga was their highest profile property, for all the wrong reasons. Despite Episode 1 having strong sales, Episode 2 was a critical and commercial failure, while Episode 3 was so low profile it barely registered on anybody's radar. Sad as it may be, but for most fans, Xenosaga was at that point nothing more than a self-indulgent train wreck. So it must have come as a shock to those fans when, in April of 2007, Monolithsoft announced that they had been acquired by, of all people, Nintendo. Response to the acquisition, at least among American fans, was overwhelmingly negative. In their history of Monolithsoft, Kotaku unearthed a number of old forum posts commenting on the acquisition, most of whom are baffled, with one joking that they're looking forward to Super Mario's existential musings. As weird as it may have seemed to those fans, the acquisition made a lot more sense if you understood the relationship between Monolithsoft and Nintendo up to that point. Shortly after its foundation, Nintendo approached Monolithsoft with the idea of producing a new game in the Mother series that would be released for the GameCube. Obviously, this idea never made it past the conceptual stage. Nevertheless, the two companies began a working relationship, which resulted in the development of 2003's Baten Kaitos, Eternal Wings and the Lost Ocean. Directed by Monolithsoft co-founder Yasuyuki Hone and written by Xenogears alum Masato Kato, Baten Kaitos won over fans with its fascinating world, its creative card-based battle system, and the fact that it was an RPG released on the GameCube in an era where basically every role-playing game was a Sony exclusive. Though the game was considered a sales disappointment, it developed, and continues to maintain, a dedicated cult following, such that Namco greenlit a prequel that would release 3 years later, and, against all logic, an HD collection of the two games that's scheduled to be released on the Switch in mid-2023. Psst, hey, Namco, maybe, just maybe, if you think you can make money releasing an HD collection of Baten Kaitos, a game you admitted at the time was a financial disappointment, you can probably make money releasing an HD collection of one of your other RPG series that was more commercially successful and has thousands of fans all over the world who would gladly throw money your way for such a release. Just think about it, okay? Thanks.
And that's one to grow on.
Aside from the GameCube, Monolithsoft is also eager to develop for Nintendo's other platforms. Xenosaga 1 and 2 was released for the DS in 2006, and the studio was an early adopter of the Wii, developing a game that, after some delays, released in late 2008, Disaster Day of Crisis. So Nintendo had proven to be a fruitful publishing partner, and by the mid-2000s, Monolithsoft must have had an inkling that partnering with them would be much more rewarding going forward. When the studio had formed in 1999, under the aegis of Namco and their CEO, Masaya Nakamura, They had been promised the freedom to create the kind of challenging work they had desired to make, and for a while they had exactly that. However, executive shuffling at Namco, in addition to their impending merger with toy giant Bandai, ensured that this kind of freedom was not going to be a guarantee for much longer. Meanwhile, Nintendo, under then-president Satoru Iwata and his managing director Shinji Hatano, encouraged the studio to create something that other developers weren't making. Obviously, this is exactly the message Monolith Soft wanted to hear, and so they became a first-party developer for Nintendo, with Soma Bringer as their first game released as a subsidiary. Tetsuya Takahashi, the creator of Xenosaga and Xenoblade, developed Soma Bringer's original concept in a way that was radically different from his work in the past. With Xenosaga, Takahashi had the entire story outlined before he even spent a minute designing the actual game. With Soma Bringer, he entirely reversed the process, crafting a story to complement the gameplay mechanics. Though he did not say this explicitly, given that he's been vocal about how unbearable the development of Xenosaga was to him, it can easily be guessed that this change in design philosophy came about as a direct response. As for those gameplay mechanics, originally Takahashi and his team planned on creating a standard turn-based game, but after giving some thought to the architecture of the DS, and the fact that it's ideally designed for games played in short bursts at a time, they decided that an action RPG would be more appropriate, and thus retooled the entire game from scratch. But don't think that just because this was a game designed primarily around its gameplay systems that the story took a back seat, because the story is actually the primary reason why I was interested in playing Soma Bringer in the first place. The script for the game was written by Kaori Tanaka, Takahashi's wife and the co-creator of Xenogears and Xenosaga. Anyone who's watched my Xenosaga videos knows how much I respect Tanaka as a storyteller, and the mere fact that her name was in the credits was enough for me to want to check the game out, since her resume is actually fairly sparse for such a world-class talent. As a matter of fact, and this is kind of depressing, but save for a couple of guest designs for Xenoblade 2, Soma Bringer is the final game she's had any significant involvement with. Again, like Takahashi, her experiences working on Xenosaga were profoundly negative, and in her case, she seems to have taken it to heart and chose to leave the industry entirely. Anyway, before we start, there are a couple more names in the credits that I want to discuss. First, the legendary Yasunori Mitsuda, veteran composer of the Chrono series, Xenogears, and Xenosaga Episode 1, returned to compose the soundtrack for Soma Bringer. In fact, Takahashi specifically chose him for the project, and says that securing him as composer is what got the project rolling in the first place. Second, though Takahashi was Soma Bringer's creator and served as overseer of the project as a whole, he was not credited as director. That role was given to Shingo Kawabata, who had previously worked as a battle designer on Xenosaga Episode 3. This is, actually, the only game Kawabata's ever directed, as after Soma Bringer's release, he shifted into a producer role, working on both the Xenoblade franchise as well as games that Monolith Soft provided assistance on, including several games in the Legend of Zelda series. Alright, I think that's enough setup. Let's start talking about the actual game. The story of Soma Bringer is set on the mystical continent of Barnea. In this world, a magical force called Soma is used as an energy source for basically everything on the planet. Being such an important facet of human life, the use of Soma is highly regulated by an organization called, Secondaddy? Is that how you say it? Secondaddy? Hold on, let me check.
Secondity.
Secondity? Alright, I'm gonna keep calling it Secondaddy because that sounds funnier. Anyway, aside from the regulation of Soma, Secondaddy also has a military arm called Farzoof. At some point in the recent past, mysterious entities called Visitors began appearing on Barnea, taking over animals and plants and attacking human settlements. To combat these visitor attacks, Farzoof begins sending its 2nd Division to quell the chaos and bring the land to peace. On one such mission in the heart of the Junel Forest, the 7th Division encounters Idea, a girl enclosed in a cocoon that seems highly attuned to Soma. Unfortunately, she seems to have lost all her memories, and so is taken in by Secondaddy to get to the bottom of where she came from. In the meantime, the 7th Division continues to be sent on missions to assist various settlements around Barnea from attacks by the Visitors. On their missions, they quickly encounter a group of strange people known as the Umbras, who seem hell-bent on acquiring a collection of artifacts known as the Apocrypha and, most notably, seem to have some clue as to who Idea is. So I'm going to start with the story. I'm not going to go into any more detail or mention any spoilers, because I'm assuming most of you haven't had the opportunity to play this game just yet. But based on the summary I've given, a lot of you probably think that the story is a basic one, and there is some truth to that. The core of the story, especially right at first, is rather simple and episodic, especially if you're used to Takahashi and Tanaka's style from games like Xenosaga. The game is divided into 7 chapters, a prologue, and 6 main acts, and the first couple acts do kind of have the same structure. 7th Division gets a request from a different area of Barnea, they go and take care of it, and in the process, usually get caught up with the Umbras. As it progresses, though, the story does get a lot more involved. This is a game that spends much of its introductory chapters setting up a lot of questions and mysteries, and then spending most of the end untangling those mysteries. It's certainly not as complex as Xenosaga, but this is a standalone DS game. You shouldn't expect that kind of complexity anyway. But even though the story isn't as complex as, say, a Xenosaga, Takahashi and Tanaka didn't skimp at all on the world building, because, my goodness, the depth of world building in this game is nuts. The team deliberately set out to craft a world that could be detailed enough such that if they wanted to make additional Soma Bringer games, they could, and they absolutely succeeded. Every character, every region of Barnea is incredibly detailed and distinct, with a sense of character and history comparable to Takahashi and Tanaka's previous works. They even, much like Xenosaga, included a glossary where the player can read up on aspects of the world in greater detail, and it's, oh no. So, here's the thing. Soma Bringer was never officially released outside of Japan, so the only reason why we in the English-speaking world are able to play it is because of a fan translation. When I downloaded this fan translation, I saw in the release notes that the game was 98% translated, and I thought, that's interesting. I wonder what the other 2% is. And yeah, it turns out that it's the glossary. There are a couple entries that were translated, but the vast majority of it is entirely in Japanese. And this is a damn shame. Obviously, the glossary isn't necessary to enjoy the game. You can understand the story perfectly well without it. But one of the joys of any Takahashi and Tanaka project is being able to completely immerse yourself in the worlds that they've created. And these glossaries are one of the ways to do that. Of course, this isn't at all the fault of the developers, it's the translators, and honestly, I have no idea why they left it in the state that it's in. I mean, it would have made sense if they translated the entire thing or left the entire thing in Japanese, but to cherry pick a couple entries and just translate those and only those? That's a really odd choice. I hope that someone, someday, will go back and translate the rest of those entries, so we can get that 98% translated statistic up to an even 100. Alright, let's get into the gameplay. Farzoof's 7 Division has 7 members, and when you start a new game, you can choose to play as any one of those 7, with Idea becoming unlockable once you've beaten the game. Each character has their own specific set of attributes, being strong in certain areas and weak in others. For my playthrough, I chose Velt because his hair reminded me of Chrono from Chrono Trigger. Once you've chosen a character, you get to choose their class. There's 6 in all, most of which will be familiar to RPG veterans, although their names make them look deceptive. Battlers are basically warriors, Cores are paladins, Darks are dark knights, Gunners, well, they use guns, Comps are ninjas, and Somas are wizards or mages. As can be expected, each class has its own set of strengths and, most importantly, weapon proficiencies. Personally, whenever I play a game that requires class choices, I go with warrior types, so I chose a battler that can use a one-handed sword and shield. Once you've got your character and class, the game itself begins. Regardless of which character you've chosen, the story doesn't change, as every member of 7th Division always travels together. In addition to your character, you can choose 2 additional members of 7th Division to assist you, which can be switched out at any time. They're either controlled by the game's AI, or if you have the capabilities, by 2 other players via the DS's wireless connectivity. This multiplayer capability is, unfortunately, something that we in the West really can't have access to, since we're basically forced to rely on downloading the fan translation, and that's a shame, since if you read any of the developer interviews about the game, they make a big deal about how multiplayer was incorporated into the gameplay mechanics from the beginning. The ability to play cooperatively was obviously a very important facet to them, and it sucks that, since the game never got a Western release, we can't take advantage of it. Anyway, you've got your character, got your party, pretty soon you're going to run into some enemies, and since combat is a major part of the game, let's talk about the combat system. Soma Bringer is commonly described as a hack-and-slash game. A lot of Western reviewers have compared the style of combat to Diablo, although when I played I was more reminded of Secret of Mana, probably because the visual style is much closer to the Mana series, and because, like Secret of Mana, you're assisted by AI-controlled party members, although you'll be thrilled to hear that the characters in Soma Bringer control much, much better than in Secret of Mana. Although, when I think about it, the combat probably does feel closer to Diablo than any of the Mana games. You got a basic attack, and can assign additional class-based skills. Skills are expended through skill points, and can be chained together to form combos. Attacking an enemy enough times will cause the enemy to enter a break state, where their defense is lowered and they're temporarily stunned, but be careful since your party can also fall into the break state as well. It's a simple system to be sure, but I always found it a satisfying one. The relative simplicity of combat brings up an important point. If you're the kind of player who demands a challenge in every game you play, then Soma Bringer may not be the game for you, as it's a relatively easy one. This was very much by design. Takahashi has been open with the fact that the game was designed to be accessible to people who may not have had any experience playing RPGs before, especially younger children. In one interview, he specifically mentions playing with his elementary school-age son and daughter. Aside from the difficulty of the game itself not being super high, there are a number of quality of life additions that ensures this accessibility. The only character you have to worry about managing is your own. Your other party members level up automatically and never need skill or equipment adjustments. Further, there really is no way to get a game over in Soma Bringer. If your party falls in battle, you're transported back to the Act's main town. You have to spend a bit of money to resurrect your fallen party members, but because it's really easy to earn money in this game by selling off your excess and unnecessary equipment, this is usually nothing more than a formality. And unlike other games of its ilk, dying in Soma Bringer doesn't cause you to lose your equipment. All that happens is you lose the experience points you've accumulated. But if you return to the point where you died, you regain it back, and this is easy enough to do since there are warp points scattered throughout the dungeons, meaning you're probably never going to be more than a few map screens away from where you died. Personally, I don't have any issues with this relative lack of difficulty. I understand it was a conscious choice on the part of the development team, and I'm not the kind of person who demands every game be some kind of impossible challenge. In fact, I found the difficulty refreshing, as I enjoy balancing out harder games with easier ones. But I do understand that not everyone is going to feel the same way I do, so I figured it would be worth bringing up. But even if you're the kind of person who generally likes more difficult games, you still may be interested in Soma Bringer, because the amount of customization at your disposal is kind of impressive. I already mentioned that you have the choice of 1 in 8 characters and 6 classes, so right there you have 48 different ways of playing through the game. Each class has access to a couple different kinds of weapons and armor, which can either be purchased in shops or found in treasure chests. And the amount of weapons and armor in this game, even if you narrow it down to just the kinds that your specific class has access to, there must be hundreds and hundreds of individual pieces, such that it's probably impossible to see them all in one playthrough. Aside from this ridiculous amount of equipment customization, you also have the freedom to customize the attributes of your characters. Every time you level up, you require a number of class points and ability points. Class points can be spent to increase your strength, magic, vitality, and skill level. As for ability points, each character has 4 different styles of abilities, and each style has 4 different levels within it. There's generally about 2 or 3 different abilities within each ability level, and each ability level is unlocked at predetermined points throughout the game. Abilities perform a wide variety of functions. There are more powerful attacks, non-attack skills that impacts enemy behavior, and auto abilities that continually modify your character's attributes. You can increase each ability's level to a maximum of 20, and ability levels can be adjusted at any time throughout the game, meaning you can constantly transform your character into exactly the kind of fighter you want depending on where you are in the game. I've always been impressed with the amount of customization in Takahashi's games, and I'm glad to see that Soma Bringer is no exception to that. Now I really want to go over some presentational stuff. First off, I absolutely love how this game looks. The art director on Soma Bringer is Tony Koo, a name I admittedly wasn't familiar with at all until I started research on this video. His credits are quite small and kind of all over the place. He served as a designer on such disparate games like Chocobo Racing, Final Fantasy XII, and Dawn of Mana. Soma Bringer is the first, and to date the only game where he's gotten to serve as art director, and let me just say, I'd love for him to get some more work because the world of Soma Bringer is just beautiful. There's such a variety of locations to explore that perfectly complements the diverse world Takahashi and Tanaka built. Every location, regardless of whether it's a town or a dungeon, is so vibrant and pleasing to look at. In many ways, the look of Soma Bringer reminds me of Chrono Cross, which I've always regarded as one of the most beautiful looking games of its generation. I only have one real complaint about the look of the game, and it's not even a real complaint since it's not something the development team could have had any control over. Obviously, a lot of care and attention was put into crafting this world, and honestly, the DS's graphical fidelity sells it so short. If there's one game that I'd love to see remastered and re-released for the Switch, Soma Bringer would be it. The thought of seeing these environments in HD is an opportunity too good to pass up. The character designs are also very nice. Tadahiro Usuda's only had one other leading design role before Soma Bringer, and that was on the cult Square action RPG Threads of Fate. And I think he's someone else who deserves more work as well. Perhaps because he came up from Square in the late 90s, his work reminds me of Tetsuya Nomura's, which is a really easy comparison to make when playing Soma Bringer since one character is basically Sephiroth, and the rest of them look like they'd fit in perfectly well in the next Kingdom Hearts game. As for the music, it's a Yasunori Mitsuda score. I could just end it right there because that tells you everything you need to know. It's phenomenal, as always. The fact that he could compose 3 discs worth of music for a DS game is a testament to his talent. It's interesting that I just spent some time talking about how the game's graphics remind me of Chrono Cross, because Mitsuda's soundtrack also reminds me more of Chrono Cross than any of his earlier work, which again is a good thing because, along with Xenogears, Chrono Cross is probably my favorite of his works. I noticed that YouTube is lacking in rips of the Soma Bringer OST, so if you check out the video description, I'll provide a link to another site where you can check it out. So far, I've been pretty positive about Soma Bringer, and that's because I don't honestly have too many negative things to say about it. Really, I can think of only 2 issues that I have with the game, and neither are huge deal breakers for me. The first is that, and I'm just going to be blunt here, the side content in Soma Bringer is lame. Most of it consists of additional quests that you can agree to from NPCs in town, usually consisting of finding some rare item somewhere in the dungeons you explore. It's extremely basic, and for the most part I really didn't find them worth doing. You don't really get any significant additions to the world building, and the rewards weren't much better than what you can find by just normally exploring the game as usual. There are a couple of bonus dungeons that open up later in the game, as well as after you've beaten it at least once, but these are very much the exceptions to the rule. It's not like I demand impeccable side content in every RPG that I play, but when I see a world this elaborately designed filled with side quests that are this basic, I can't help but be a bit disappointed at the incredible amount of wasted potential. My second issue is a bit more complicated. I'm of the opinion that the main characters of Soma Bringer aren't that interesting, and I think this is a direct result of the gameplay systems the team designed. Because the player is given the choice of 7 and later 8 characters to play as, the game really doesn't feel like it has a main character. It seems like Velt was supposed to be the main character, since he's introduced as the new recruit to 7th Division and he has an obvious connection to Idea right from the start, but he never really gets the attention to make him feel like it is. Since the game starts with every character front and center from the beginning, and seems to focus more on 7th Division as a unit rather than as individuals, I never felt like I got to know the characters individually as well as I should have. This is compounded by the fact that Soma Bringer is a short game, around 25 hours, maybe a bit longer. With such a relatively short amount of time and a high number of main characters to focus on, it was inevitable that their development was going to feel lacking. There are some exceptions to this, like with Granada and Cadenza's relationship, but overall, Soma Bringer was a game where I felt like the side characters far outclassed the mains, probably because the game wasn't forced to split the attention of the side characters in the same way as the mains. The Umbras go from being kind of run-of-the-mill mysterious bad guys to characters with interesting motivations, and some of the other members of Second Daddy, Master Laban especially, get a lot of attention in the second half of the game. Again, I understand that the way the game was designed probably contributed to all this, but the fact that I had this much trouble connecting with what was supposed to be the main characters of the game is a criticism I can't overlook. So that's Soma Bringer, a game that's been criminally overlooked and an important missing link in Monolithsoft's history. The fact that the game is as well crafted as it is raises an obvious question. Why has it never gotten the attention it deserves? To me, the answer is obvious. Even though it was a success in Japan, both critically and commercially, Soma Bringer had the absolute misfortune to be released at what was probably the lowest point of Monolithsoft's esteem in the eyes of the American video game industry. To them, MonolithSoft was the failure that embarrassed themselves with Xenosaga, and it's telling that almost all of their games, after Xenosaga Episode 3, were entirely passed over for release by Nintendo of America. Soma Bringer was ignored, Disaster Day of Crisis was ignored. Hell, the only reason why Xenoblade came out at all was because the geniuses behind Operation Rainfall managed to shift the conversation in their favor. But even after Xenoblade re-established MonolithSoft's reputation in the West, most people continued to pass Soma Bringer by, and there are a number of different factors that played into this. Obviously, the fact that the game is accessible only via a fan translation is going to limit its reach right from the start. Further limiting its reach is the fact that Soma Bringer has never, not even in Japan, been given a re-release since it was dropped in 2008. Compare that to the first Xenoblade. That game released in Japan in 2010, in Europe in 2011, the same year that saw the beginning of Operation Rainfall, in America in 2012, on the 3DS worldwide in 2015, and the Switch worldwide in 2020. And remember, that's just the first game. That's saying nothing about its sequels and spin-offs that also released during that period. Xenoblade's constant releases and re-releases means that it's never really had the chance to fall out of fan consciousness. This stands in complete contradistinction to Soma Bringer's singular release in Japan. If games aren't kept accessible, not only does it, by necessity, drive fans to emulation, but ensures that great games will never get a fair chance. Soma Bringer deserves a high-profile re-release on the Switch, not just because the game's graphics would benefit so much from such a re-release, but because, in so many ways, the game has never really gotten the opportunities to succeed. I really think that this game could do well if given the chance, and I'd love for that to happen, not just because I think it's a good game, but because of what that could mean for Monolith Soft going forward. Remember, Takahashi and Tanaka crafted the world of Soma Bringer in such a way that they could tell additional stories in that world if they wanted to, and of course, this hasn't happened yet. But there's so much potential for additional stories. Just to mention the most obvious, Barnea, the continent where the game is set, is but one in a much larger world. This is a world I'd love to spend some more time in, and now that it seems like Monolith Soft is moving on beyond Xenoblade, another Soma Bringer game may not be outside the realm of possibility. Whether or not that actually happens, the point still stands. Soma Bringer is a game that doesn't deserve to be forgotten. Load up your DS emulator and give it a download.